Dear friends, with thanks to our Stryker Center and its director, Dr. Gadi Levy, it is my privilege to introduce Bianna Golodryga, CNN anchor and senior global affairs analyst. You have seen her in many capacities on CNN, including anchoring One World at noon Eastern on CNN International and CNN Max. Prior to joining CNN, she served as co-anchor for CBS This Morning and weekend anchor for ABC's Good Morning America. She began her career in television news with CNBC in 2001 as a bureau producer from the New York Stock Exchange. An Emmy Award winner, Ms. Golodryga's expertise ranges from the financial markets to Russian political affairs. Shortly after October 7th, she was with us to moderate a conversation between Dan Senor and Ambassador Tom Nides on the challenges of the moment for Israel. And when the evening was over, I commented to our member, Jeff Zucker, who of course knew Bianna from CNN, that Senor and Nides were good, but Bianna Golodryga was great. To which he responded, "She is, and you should ask her back to tell her own story." And so we have. Please welcome to the Bima, Bianna Golodryga.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. It is wonderful to have you back.
It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. While most of our conversation tonight will address how Israel's war against Hamas is being covered in the media and the treatment of the hostages, all against the backdrop of a possible attack from Iran, and parents, you can determine whether this conversation is right for your young kids to hear or not. I wonder, Bianna, if you might begin by telling a little bit of your story as the child of Jewish refugees from the former Soviet Union.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces. And my friend Stacy Bendit, Mazel Tov to you and your daughter for Bat Mitzvah. I moved to this country in 1980 as a political refugee at the age of 18 months with my parents, and each of us allotted $70 from the former Soviet Union, Moldova at the time. And we, unlike the other refugees who were coming to the United States en masse, the majority to New York City, Brighton Beach, Los Angeles, my parents were quite the contrarians. And at the age of 25 and 30, my parents, as we went through the immigration process in Vienna and Rome, went around speaking to all the other Soviet refugees going to you name it, which country. Now, we all left on Israeli visas, we should note that too, which I'm very grateful for and probably get to later in our conversation about the role Israel has in our lives. We left on Israeli visas. My dad had an aunt who allotted us a visa, and thus we were able to leave the Soviet Union. And in the process, they had always envisioned and wanted to come to the US. So as we were going through the process, my parents were talking to every other family and asking, "Where are you going?" And 95% of them said Brighton Beach, to which my father turned to my mother and said, "We are not going to Brighton Beach." And HIAS, the Immigrant Resettlement Agency, helped us, as they did with so many others, and said, "Well, where would you like to go?" My father was an engineer. Mind you, we had $200-something in our pockets, so no money, no language, a little baby. And my father was an engineer. My mom wanted to go somewhere warm. So those were our only prerequisites. And Haya said, "Well, there's a lovely community in Galveston, Texas that would love to sponsor you." My parents had heard of Houston. They looked on a map. They'd never heard of Galveston. But we moved to Galveston in the 1980, it was May. We stayed overnight in New York City. The weather was temperate, as it is now. And then they got to Houston. And for some odd reason, we got off. My husband's heard so many of these stories. He's here. You're going to endure a story, as he calls them. He numbers them. This is number 35. So we walk off on the tarmac, and all of a sudden, they're just inundated with this famous Texas heat. And my mother turns to him, my father, and says, "Where did you bring me?" To which he responds, Oh, Shauna, there's no such thing as heat like this. It's just from the engine of the plane. And long story short, 6 months after living in Galveston, they moved to Houston, Texas, where I grew up, and it's where they still live and thrive and continue to work. I moved here in 2001.
Can you speak a little bit about how your personal experience shapes your worldview and your approach to your work? Does it make you more inclined to focus on issues relating to Israel, to anti-Semitism?
I mean, to be honest, I think we all got a gut punch given what happened on October 7th and, the rise over the years of anti-Semitism in this country. I knew my history. I knew the history of the Soviet Union. I come from Moldova. We all know the story of the 1903 pogroms, where 49 Jews in Moldova were brutally killed and savaged, many others hurt in the most barbaric of ways. We know the story. I have to honestly say, and maybe I was naive, I never thought that we would be experiencing the level of anti-Semitism and the fear that so many Jews feel in the United States, around the world, following the attacks of October 7th. So I didn't grow up assuming that this was going to be an important issue for me to focus on professionally, other than to be proud of my own heritage. Many years I was the only Jew in my school growing up in Houston. I would go to my friends' churches, they would go to temple with me, and I naively thought that the worst was in the past. The only other time I had some trepidation about being Jewish was after 9/11. In New York, and obviously, so many of you can probably attest to that as well. Career-wise, I thought I was going to work in finance. I studied Russian East European studies in college. I really honed in on my Russian skills and language, and was very grateful that my parents forced me and paid me to speak Russian at home growing up. But I would say the tree of life shook us all. Things had been percolating for a while. Looking back now, and you look at the ADL numbers, it's clear that we had started to see an increase in anti-Semitism. And the scary part is, we saw this from both the right and the left over the last few years. After October 7th, it was a shock to the system for all of us, a tragic day, a day that forever changed us. My husband and I have never been closer. I'm sure some of you have experienced this, where you just had a connection where you felt you lived in an upside-down world and you needed reassurance from those around you that they understand right from wrong. They get what's happening in the world. And that became the two of us. And we started reflecting on the past 10 years of our lives and looking for signs. And I'm just talking about anti-Semitism, not even the attacks of October 7th, but here in the U.S. specifically. And I have to be honest, I have two wonderful older stepchildren. About 6 years ago, they were in high school. My stepdaughter just graduated. My stepson was a sophomore at GDS, Georgetown Day School. And there had been a number of alarming incidents where there had been swastikas found or written in school grounds, and we would receive the emails alerting us. And it was a very kumbaya sort of tone to the notes. We're going to get to the bottom of it. We wanted to let you know this is happening. And then after the second email, which said there were multiple swastikas that were found, my husband and I were both alarmed. Josh, most importantly, my stepson, was very upset about it. And my husband responded to the head of the school, again, a very progressive private school, many Jewish students and alum, and said something to the effect of, "This is very disturbing. We don't think that you're taking the appropriate measures and taking this seriously enough. There have been swastikas painted a number of places at the school. This isn't about just bringing the ADL and other resources in. This is where you need to get law enforcement involved and have serious conversations." The head of the school then responded and said, "Peter, I'm alarmed at your tone, to be honest with you. First of all, these swastikas were not spray painted. One was written in pencil. The other was on a dry erase board." And I bring this up because in further conversations I've had, one with an Israeli Arab Muslim journalist who I'm very close with, and the first Arab journalist on a major network in Israel who I just visited with, and she said she had a similar experience about 7 years ago. She's come to the U.S. many times. It's spoken on many college campuses. Israel is by no means a perfect country. No country is. And for an Arab Israeli to go through some of the things that she has, she can't be legally married to her husband, who's an Israeli Jew. That notwithstanding, I think she was alarmed by what she'd been seeing, the perception of Israel, the sort of casting as oppressed versus oppressor, the illegitimacy surrounding Israel over the years, and she found it important enough to come to the U.S. and speak to students. And she told me an incident she had at Yale University 7 years ago where she spoke about these issues, and after which a young Palestinian student approached her and said that she was ashamed to be a fellow Palestinian or Arab, and because of the tone she had taken, her views on Israel, and my friend Lucy Harish started having a conversation with her. And it's a serious conversation. It's uncomfortable at times, and nonetheless, you're on a college campus, that's what you're supposed to do. And all of a sudden, someone came and intervened and said, you can't talk to her anymore, you're invading her safe space. And again, I go back to this idea of how we got here, and what we're seeing on college campuses, our schools, and this didn't happen in a vacuum. I think this is all exacerbated, obviously, after October 7th, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really take a look at our education system, how we approach anti-Semitism. We are all, we're a very progressive family. We were all in favor of the steps and the resources our schools took following the tragedy of George Floyd and a lot of the DEI programs, and I think that there was really a shock to the system that when it came to anti-Semitism, it wasn't perceived to be at the level of other forms of hate. And I think that that's a real wake-up call for how I view my job as a journalist, as the mother of Jewish children, and as an American. It's our responsibility.
I was reading through the ADL's grading of colleges, came out this week. Many of you saw it. My own didn't fare all that well. I can only hope that university administrators, and it's also true of the secondary schools, will see this as a wake-up call, and that things will get better. That's my hope. I want to turn to the wonderful special that was on this past Sunday at 8 o'clock as part of Anderson Cooper's whole story series. But it was your program. You spent time interviewing hostages, both those who were released and also families of those still captive, and we pray still alive, though now tragically it appears that many of them may not be. Can you tell us about the decision first to cover the hostages and what motivated you to pursue their stories, and then we'll ask some questions about the interviews themselves.
So after October 7th, I'm sure, like many of you, I knew exactly where I was when that horrific event and the attacks happened, and I saw the alerts on my phone with the numbers continue to go and go and go and rise and rise and rise, and the number of innocent civilians who were just so brutally murdered in a way reminiscent, as I mentioned, about the Kishinev pogroms. I mean, one of the reasons for Israel is that Jews should never have to hide in closets and wait for help to come and be so fearful for their lives. So that in and of itself was a gut punch. It's a big international story. As an anchor, as a global affairs analyst, it's under my purview as well, and I thought it was the most important story that we need to cover, and in a way that I think CNN is unrivaled in how we cover, especially wars and international affairs. I wanted to go to Israel. I unfortunately was not war trained. And I had just started my new show. So we were clearly covering it from the US, and I have a lot of contacts and friends in Israel, but I wanted to be there. And I ultimately did get war trained. We expedited that process. It was already towards the end of the year, November, December, trying to figure out when we can go. And I will forever be grateful to my husband because he ultimately said, I don't know that you're going to get to go for work anytime soon. We have vacation coming up around the holidays. We should just go for a personal trip. You really want to go. It's important for you to go. I hadn't been to Israel since 1995. I can't believe it had been that long, and sadly it took this horrific attack to bring me back. But had it not been for Peter suggesting that we take this trip, I don't think any of this would have happened. I ultimately did get an interview with one. It was the first interview only after the 60 Minutes interview that Yarden Roman got, who I interviewed now for this special, but the second Israeli who had given an interview to the U.S. Media was with me, and that took place during that trip. And along the way, I'd become very close with some of these families and their mothers, and the pain that unimaginable pain that they were going through, and I'd stayed close with them. And also, while we were there, side note, my husband and I renewed our vows, which I told you about earlier, just again to reinforce what happened, what changed in us after October 7th.
Tell them who married you, though. Rabbi Sarah Reines actually officiated at their wedding.
Not in Israel, our wedding itself. Yeah, so we just saw her. It was a nice surprise. So I came back from Israel, and a couple of weeks later got a call that CNN was going to be working on a special that would air on the 6-month mark, April 7th, where they wanted to focus exclusively 1 hour on the hostages, and that they would like me to do it and that I should go back. And I naively thought, it's early February, I can't believe we're working on something now where clearly there's going to be change. Clearly, these hostages, some of them at least, are going to be released. And sadly, that never happened. I think about and pray for these hostages and their families every single day.
So Yarden Roman God is actually special to this congregation because her brother Gili spoke twice here. Your interview with her was extraordinary. She spoke to you, and I believe her words were the profound impact of captivity on the human soul. What did she tell you about that impact? And can you talk a little bit about what you learned of their emotional suffering?
I mean, it's clear that the suffering still continues. God only knows what she endured. And as she also said in the interview, many others had it a lot worse than her. I think her suffering was more psychological, emotional, obviously being separated from her 3-year-old child, who she so smartly handed over to her husband in that moment where they had a chance to run, and she knew her husband was a runner, and gave their daughter Geffen to him, and sadly she didn't make it. She was taken captive, and I asked her, was somebody with you every single day? To which she responded, every second. And she was released after 50-some days. Here we are, more than 180 days later. But she said that the toll of somebody of not having that physical space, that physical freedom to be yourself was just excruciating. And something else that I'm sure her brother relayed to you, but it was really important for her that we tell our viewers was what she had discussed at some point with her captors, and that was ultimately what their goal was. And that wasn't to take over all of Gaza, all of the kibbutzim along the south, or even all of Israel. I mean, their mission was global jihad, not two-state, never side by side, no peace. And hearing that just sends chills down your spine, because her brother, her family, many of these families, especially on the kibbutzim, were all advocates for peace. We're all advocates for a two-state solution. And so many of them don't have homes to go back to now. The displacement in Israel is unsustainable between the north and the south. But they also don't have faith in their government to keep them safe anymore.
We know that on October 7th, Israeli women were raped, brutalized by Hamas terrorists. And we now know that hostages, too, were sexually abused while they were being held captive, and those held captive are still enduring it. But somehow this has been very slow to draw the world's outrage or activism. You're going to be back with us in May to actually talk more about this. But why do you think there was so much skepticism about reports of sexual violence?
You know, that's a question I ask a lot, and why that's a hill anyone would want to die on, to really question. I mean, don't forget, these terrorists wanted the world to see what they did on October 7th. They wore GoPros, they posted videos, they uploaded videos in real time to families' Facebook accounts, called them, showed them torturing grandparents, children. We know the details. And a week or so later was when I first got wind of some of these horrific stories of the sexual violence, which tragically we know occur in war, but everything that they had seen fit the pattern of an actual plan of war, a tactic, premeditated. It had occurred in multiple places at the music festival, along the highway, and speaking to a lot of the experts, or really focusing on the right ones to speak with, I realized early on, as did some of my colleagues at CNN, including Jake Tapper, that this was a story we weren't hearing discussed anywhere, and a massive war crime. Sadly, I think some of the forensics and just the chaos of the moment, some of the evidence on the Israeli side, they weren't able to gather right away, which made it that much more difficult. But I mean, don't get me wrong, 5-6 weeks after the fact, it was pretty clear what had happened, and yet the world was silent, the UN was silent, women's organizations were silent. And I don't want to initially always go to this, well, Israeli women, you know, aren't the same as other women, or Jewish women aren't seen the same as other women. But the only answer I can come up with is that for anybody trying to defend what they view as resistance or freedom fighters, in the Quran, in the Islamic faith, rapes are illegal and banned. And so there's no justification whatsoever for the heinous attacks that were committed against women and men too, by the way. And that's the only conclusion I can come to, but it's a shame, it's tragic, and and kudos to CNN for allowing us to, I mean, we were really there, you know, among the early networks to hone in on this issue and talk about it, and I think, you know, we'll probably hear more horrific stories to come. The pessimist in me can't help but think it's not a coincidence that all of the hostages that have been released thus far, relatively speaking, were not treated as horribly physically as we're hearing stories and witness testimony and released hostage accounts of what's going on and what some of the remaining hostages have endured.
Historically, Israel has placed a very high value on the lives of anyone taken in war. In such a way that it often has led to severe imbalances for negotiation of hostages, including for the hostages that came back. But the greatest example of it was Gilad Shalit, who was taken, an IDF soldier, in 2006 and returned 5 years later for more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. There are approximately 130 hostages still remaining in Gaza. And with all of that history of the emphasis on bringing people home, it isn't clear that for Prime Minister Netanyahu, the return of the hostages is as much a priority as the defeat of Hamas. Do you agree with that? And if so, you know, why do you think that's the case? And what are the calculations that go into a deal for the return of hostages?
I mean, isn't that even horrible to have to ask? I mean, to even speculate that the prime minister of the country that it's just endured its worst attack in history, specifically against civilians, one has to question what his intentions are. I asked an Israeli source early into this war how he could possibly sleep at night. And the response was, he doesn't sleep well, but what keeps him awake is not what would keep you and me awake. And I always go back to that, the idea that perhaps he's doing this to stay in power, perhaps he's doing this to avoid jail time. It's clear that his poll numbers are going down. What I've heard from so many Israelis, especially as we recall those early days after October 7th, was just the overwhelming appreciation and gratitude for the support that Israel received from President Biden. That had been unprecedented, to have a U.S. president go to Israel during wartime to embrace these families. I heard the same about Secretary of State Blinken. And maybe you could write it off as him just not having that human, compassion chip that Biden has as a consoler-in-chief. But all these months later, I've just heard too many stories of families and reporters telling me that, Bibi didn't really even reach out to their families. Maybe he wrote a letter to some of them. We see the protests now, all these months later, and how some of these families are treated. And so, to answer your question, I think it couldn't be more unfortunate that a war that would likely be conducted more or less similarly, had anyone else been prime minister, is viewed so questionably, and the prime minister's motives are challenged in a way that prime minister of all people to be in charge of this war is someone like Bibi Netanyahu. I think that ultimately, I don't know what's in his heart, but you're not the first person to raise this question.
You spent a lot of time with Israelis on camera and off, and no doubt got a sense from them of their concerns. So I'm curious as to what dominant impressions you came away with about their feelings about the current government, about the prospects of peace, about the vision of a two-state solution. What were some of the things that you heard?
I think from both sides in the polling, especially in the first few months after October 7th, the idea of a two-state solution, there wasn't an appetite for it from either party. They couldn't talk about it. What was noticeable in Israel both times that we were there, and they have a very robust, free press, is they don't cover the war in Gaza the way we do. They don't see all of the images the way we do. And they rightly are still so traumatized, so wounded. I mean, you just think about the scale of the loss that they suffered that day, such a small country. Arabs and Jews, by the way, and to have 130, you mentioned Gilad Shalit, what they did, the lengths they went to for one soldier. You have 130 people who are still being held, and from their perspective, this war could all end or greatly end for an extended period of time. The scale would largely be diminished if these hostages were just returned. So I think there's confusion about, sort of what they view as victim blaming, that Israel is getting perhaps more attention, more scrutiny than other countries would in this situation. That's not for me to decide. I think historically we can probably go back and look at every single war, anytime there have been skirmishes, any issue relating to the Middle East and Israel and the Palestinians in particular, did get outsized, I think, attention. And people are, this is the 1-year anniversary of the Sudanese civil war. And how often do you hear, sadly, about the atrocities happening there? So I think there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of, feelings of isolation among Israelis. And as journalists, and especially, at CNN, I'm not sitting here saying, we're perfect or we've made all the right steps, but I think we've covered both stories. We've covered, war is horrible. We've covered the suffering among Palestinians in Gaza, and yet 6 months later, we've dedicated an hour to hostages, because for me, it's so important that we not forget how this war started. And to our credit, to his credit, our CEO, Mark Thompson, in the early days of the war and months later, would constantly remind us of that during our morning meetings. how did this begin? Let's not forget how this started and what happened on that day.
It's true. I have felt from the beginning, and CNN is on in my house all the time, that that point, how it began, is always mentioned. You talked about coverage in Israel. You talked a little bit about CNN. So let me ask you about the mainstream media coverage of the conflict in the United States. Do you think that it's generally been fair to Israel and to the concerns of the Palestinians, who obviously are enduring death and destruction on a devastating scale?
So I don't want to speak for other networks and other media per se. I think, again, no network is perfect, and this is sadly an issue that's very polarizing. People have differing views on Israel, on the occupied territories. Anytime there is fighting, we do tend to see emotions run a bit hotter. I think as a nation and as a network, and we're all entitled to our own feelings, I will say that there hasn't been a story that we haven't covered for that reason. It's, if we have our story that's vetted, if we have our sources, we go through a process that's very professional and to make sure that we cover both sides. I will say that we've given both sides ample opportunities to have their, for Israel's perspective, to have leadership speak to us. I can't say, I think they've always done a stellar job in making their case. Again, that's not my job, but that's just my personal take on how they've approached this and some of the tactics they've taken or resorted to or talking points. As we know, there is no leadership, really, for the Palestinian voice. Hamas is a terror organization and should be eradicated and never have a position of power again. A lot of questions should be asked about how this Israeli government allowed Hamas to collect hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. But I will say, for the most part, I feel very comfortable with our coverage, with my coverage, and what I've been working on specifically, which is focused on October 7th itself, the hostages, anti-Semitism, and obviously the sexual crimes.
Sadly, a lot of the information that people get today is not from networks like CNN, but rather they're picking it off TikTok and other social media platforms. And we know that as a result, it is influencing the opinions, particularly of the generations that use those platforms. The standing of Israel among younger Americans has certainly fallen. Why is Israel always held to a higher standard than everybody else?
That is a good question. I don't know. I hear time and time again that the government, the policies that my generation had grown up knowing, reading about, experiencing is different from the current. I will say that unlike Vladimir Putin, I am from the former Soviet Union, I know a thing or two about authoritarian and democracies falling apart. It is uncomfortable to see a democracy continue to elect the same person time and time again. I do think term limits are there for a reason in many countries, and obviously that's, Israel is allowed for in their legal system to have someone who's been there for, I think, longer now than Ben Gurion. But I think you see once again an example, and I brought up Vladimir Putin, who is now going to go on, who's been there 24 years plus, can be there for another 12 more years. I think power corrupts. I think, to your earlier question, we were covering very closely the judicial reforms in Israel last year. If only that were the big story. We thought that this was an existential threat to Israel at the time. But it was on every single day. I mean, we were covering those protests every single day. So you can ask yourself, why does it need that much attention? I don't know, but there's an interest. And it was an important story. And it's the only democracy in the Middle East. And as Jews, we do hold ourselves in general to a higher standard. So I think to answer your question, while as an American, I think many Jews would say, whether regardless of their connection to Israel or not, that maybe a Jewish state should be held to a higher standard as well.
You commented earlier about how October 7th has resulted in a circling of the wagons, a return to a Jewish home. It's certainly the case we have found here that people have come in greater numbers to worship, to programs that are focused on Israel. This has been a very painful time, but it's also been a time that, for tragic reasons, has brought the Jewish community together. But we know that the greatest response to those who would do us harm is always going to be the celebration and embrace of Jewish life. And so I want to conclude our conversation with this last question, which is, what do you love most about being Jewish? What do you love most about Israel? You spoke a little bit about the role Israel played in bringing you from the Soviet Union to America. What do you love about being Jewish?
We're unique. It makes life more interesting, I think. I know I have a much more interesting story than had I stayed. God knows what I would have been doing in Moldova. We have a rich history. We have a rich culture. We've overcome so much. Growing up, we weren't very observant. Obviously, being raised in the Soviet Union, my parents didn't have the luxury of being bar mitzvahed, having attended services. But boy, did they love their Jewish culture and their values and respect for life and value for life. I mean, you just think about going back to the start of time when Jews valued life more than anything else, and preserving life was your most important responsibility. And so here, when we see that we're attacked once again, you're reminded of being a minority. You continue to have, sadly, the same conversations with your children. Why us? Why am I so different? Why can't I be Christian? Why can't I be like my friends? But I think even for our own children who we have this conversation with, there's a newfound appreciation for being different, for knowing our history, and also respecting others as well in society. So I think it's a wonderful journey. I love being Jewish. I wouldn't have it any other way. I think that a lot of this does start with education and making sure that our children feel comfortable in being Jewish too, because I will say it's really alarming to raise children in New York City of all places and worry about showcasing their Judaism and talking to their schools and teachers and seeing clearly that they have no resources and are very ill prepared to handle this issue. And it's one of, mankind's oldest cancers that we still can't seem to eradicate.
I have to say, I'm always grateful when I see you on TV. I was grateful when you were here in the fall. I'm grateful you're coming back to us in the spring, and I'm certainly grateful you spent Shabbat evening with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Bianna Golodryga.
Thank you.
And Shabbat Shalom,
Shabbat
everybody.
Shalom.